follow up on our tag team presentation on the Andrews. Mario and I had to carve up the Andrews story, kind of like two generals plotting our battle. And so I was more interested in the Andrews' relations with the Shakers themselves. Well, maybe not more interested, but given that Mario's actual life experience and his broader range of knowledge and the cultural milieu in which the Andrews existed, it made sense for him to write that essay. And of course, dealing with the primary sources that we have at Hancock and at Winterthur, it was very easy for me to put together the story of the Andrews' interactions with the Shakers themselves, which is probably one of the more controversial parts of the larger Andrews story, because it's the revisionist scholars who've attacked them on that front most aggressively, charging them, as Mario had mentioned, as kind of being these vultures circling the decaying villages and picking off pieces from unsuspecting old ladies and selling them at a great profit. It was very clear to me as I began to read the primary sources that while the Andrews certainly had conflicts with certain Shakers, overwhelmingly they had extremely positive relations with the Shakers in general and many individual Shakers. The other side of that coin is that a lot of these Shaker families themselves were in deep internal strife during this time of decline. And that fed into some of these conflicts that individual Shakers had with the Andrews. One of the things that I don't need to tell this group, but Shakerism is a top-down hierarchical communal society with a community of goods and a very strict way in which things are acquired by the community or things are disposed of by the community. And it involves, of course, at the family level, deacons, and then elders in association with trustees that have the authority to sell things. This matter of authority is something that is central to the Andrews story, and the conflicts between the authorities within the families, because by that time this original order of Shakerism was very much broken down in a lot of these communities. So that is the underlying background of a lot of what I'll be talking about. Now if I can just get the lights to go off, which I tried to do before I stepped out there. Yeah, that's me last Halloween. That was a time of, some difficulty in my life, and I was so into the Andrews story that I took it just a little too far.
You actually put on a tie.
Yeah, and I put on a tie. That's when they knew I was crazy. Yeah. No, of course, that's the young Ted Andrews, and that again was one of the best parts about this project, working with the Andrews' surviving daughter and then the grandsons and David Andrews' widow on the other side. We got so many wonderful images because I know that I had only ever seen Ted Andrews as a kind of Mr. Clean-looking old man, and photo of him at Fort Devens and these early photos, and there's a wonderful one of Faith just after they got married. Really, this is how the Andrews looked when they were in their heyday, when they were interacting with the Shakers, and I think we forget that. It's like if you've been watching The Tudors on Showtime and there's the young Henry VIII, people forget that he was a young athletic guy at one point. Well, enough about that. So I mentioned that my research took me to the archives of Winterthur, where I did a month-long fellowship, and Sandra was actually my fellowship, what do they call you, like master or something? Yeah. Which mostly involved, which mostly involved vodka, which was great. Yeah. And great dinners out, thanks to both of you guys. But this collection down there, for those of you that haven't had the chance to use it, is amazing. I think there's 27 large archival boxes of the open archives. Then there's another 13 or so that have been restricted archives. That's been a matter of some controversy with scholars. I think has in a way made them more critical of the Andrews. But why is there restricted archives of primary source material? To be honest with you, I believe that it is because Anne Kane, facing the unenviable task of giving the rest of her parents' papers to Winterthur, because the original bulk had been given by Faith herself, with all the oversight that she wished to exercise. I think Anne Kane didn't go through those and was worried what might be in there. So to this day, if you want to use those papers, you have to get permission from the family. Now, I thought these were going to be the juicy papers, you know. No, really, the restricted archives is just all stuff from the 80s and 90s. No old source material, and it's just mainly press clippings and, you know, ephemera from when Faith gave talks. So there was no real gems there. But in the main archives, there's all this correspondence. Of course, we only have the Shakers side of it, but we do have some of the handwritten drafts of Ted Andrews' letters to the Shakers, beginning in the late 1920s. One of the things I found in there was a very late manuscript that Faith had written after Ted's death that apparently was going to be some kind of an introductory piece to some publication that I had never found in existence, so I don't think this ever went anywhere. But she wrote a sentence about the Andrews' first visit into the brick dwelling in Hancock in 1923, the second time that the Andrews had stopped at Hancock to buy bread, not the first, which is a minor point, but you know, might as well get the facts straight. And she wrote that entering the brick dwelling when they were invited in by Sister Alice Smith to sit and wait while the bread was being wrapped, she wrote, "Pandora's box was empty compared with our first glimpse beyond the kitchen door." And in this manuscript, that line is crossed out, and she rethinks what she wants to say. But I realized that that probably was a very true statement as she looked back over their lives. That, as you know, Pandora's box from Greek mythology unleashes primarily negative human emotions. At the bottom, there is still hope remaining. But the story of the Andrews, not only interactions with the Shakers, but with the world at large, had so much jealousy, so much strife, so much unhappiness, and of course, to the end of Ted's life, that was the case, and continued through Faith's remaining years, as we'll hear a little bit about. So, 1923, the Andrews turn up at Hancock. At that point, and I'm so glad Steve Patterwood went to the gym this morning. The pressure's off. But Hancock at that time consisted of Frances Hall living in the trustee's office and basically on her own, and then the family in general living in the brick dwelling house. At that time, there was only one brother in the community, Brother Ricardo Belden, who variously lived in the Brethren's shop or in the brick dwelling as the years went by. Elders Fanny Estabrook was the eldest of the church family, and generally the sisterhood consisted of much older individuals with still some young girls in their care, and then a very small kind of sandwich generation of Alice Smith and Olive Hayden, who later became Olive Hayden Austin. And this was the group that the Andrews encountered. Here in the upper picture you'll see Alice and Ethel Smith as little girls. Ethel is on the left. She married and left the community. Alice never did, and so there's Alice on the right. She was a real burden bearer, is a term we use in Shaker studies to talk about these younger women that really took care of these aged members. We don't have a lot that she wrote because the Andrews lived in such close proximity to Hancock. There's really only one letter that I've found between the two of them. It's a very, very interesting letter. It's a very gossipy letter. It talks about movie stars. It talks about Shaker confession. And it's clear that the Andrews' friendship with her was very familiar and very earthy. She even signs the letter of the earthy, yours, Alice. So we find ourselves in 1923 with a situation that really was unprecedented in Shaker communities, where a young couple, a young attractive couple from Pittsfield, can come to a Shaker community befriend one of the rank and file members, and spend the evenings in her room, just hanging out, you know, listening to the radio, talking about Shakerism. And this would not have been possible at any other time. But it's another symptom of the decline. And so the other big players in this early period of Hancock, Eldridge Fanny Estabrook I mentioned, and then Clara Spurl. Those of you who were at seminar in 2005 remember we watched the oral history that I was able to do with Clara Spurl, which was an unbelievable find and so perfectly timed for the relevance to this story. Clara was born in Yonkers, New York. Her mother died of tuberculosis. Her cousins had been put at the Mount Lebanon Shakers, so her father knew of the Shakers and brought Claire up. She went by Clara and Claire, so that's either one. Brought Clara up and placed her with the Hancock Shakers in 1925. She arrived on Halloween night. Those of you that have seen the pictures from Halloween at Hancock, the Shakers pulled out all the stops. They were all in costumes. The kids were in costumes. They did the, you know, fingers in spaghetti or brains and the peeled grapes for eyeballs and that kind of stuff. And so as a little girl, she told me that, you know, she was kind of scared that first night. She didn't know where the heck she knew it was Halloween, but still, this big old brick house. She, as I said, was under the immediate care of Eldridge Fanny Estabrook, and first came into contact with the Andrews and William Winter around 1925 or so, at least the Andrews, and then by 2930 with William Winter. One of the things the Andrews are criticized for is the aesthetic that William Winter established through his photographs, which has influenced the interpretation of Shaker interiors so much over the 20th century, really. And the Andrews are clear that they don't intend these photographs to accurately represent historical settings. It's right in the introduction to Shaker furniture. So I don't know why they're criticized for it. But little Clara there was William Winter's assistant. She would be the one when Winter called from Schenectady and said he was coming over, Eldridge Fanny would tell her to go and, you know, get such and such chair and such thing. They'd move these things into the sister shop at Hancock, the Dairy and Weave shop, and she would work with Winter during the days taking these photographs. Her memories of the Andrews were those of a child. She described Faith as being one of the most beautiful women she had ever seen. She was tall and willowy, and you know, people that knew Faith, and I never did. I mean, she apparently wasn't that tall, but the eyes of this little girl who hadn't really seen a woman from the outside, this was quite an attractive lady. And so she was somewhat privy to, and she was very good friends with Alice Smith, who was kind of like a second mother to her, to Alice's relations with the Andrews. And she was aware, even as a little girl, that things were leaving the community and going to the Andrews. And Eldridge Fanny, of course, was aware of this as well. So Claire recalled how, as a little girl, Eldridge Fanny would call their driver, have him get the car ready. They'd go do some errands in Pittsfield, and then they would drop in unannounced on the Andrews house on, I think, Whittier Avenue at that point. Is that Whittier or Clinton?
Whittier.
Clinton, okay. So they would drop in because Eldridge Fanny wanted to see what else had made its way from the brick dwelling into the Andrews house. Well, this gives the impression that Eldridge Fanny did not approve of things being sold directly to the Andrews by Alice Smith. And I think it is an accurate impression, but it's limited because we have in our exhibit at Hancock a tripod stand with a gift inscription, a presentation inscription from Christmas 1931 when Eldridge Fanny Estabrook gave that stand to the Andrews. So there was a conflict at a couple different levels where things were being sold, the money wasn't necessarily going where it should have been going, things were also being given away, and they generally liked the Andrews too, so there wasn't begrudgingly that these things were being given away, but it was unclear. The letter that I mentioned that we have from Alice Smith alludes to kind of a chit that she'd been keeping of all the things the Andrews had bought over the course of the 20s and the early 30s, that they were slowly paying off. Many of us are familiar with that method of buying things. The Andrews were no different. I think as Mario pointed out, they didn't come from money. But what they had was this keen interest, this keen eye, and an overwhelming obsession and passion to acquire whatever they could. And luckily, they had the personal charisma to develop the relationships to make that possible. So, add into this mix Elders Frances Hall, who was the trustee. I think beginning in 1918, after Joseph Holden died, she became the society trustee, and then eventually became, and by that I mean of Hancock and Lebanon as a combined economic entity, which they were by that time, but eventually she became a trustee for the entire United Society. Now, Frances, as I mentioned, lived alone in the trustee's office. She had a German Shepherd, and if you go to the building today, you can still see the claw marks, I assume, from her dog on those doors. Her sister, like Alice Smith's sister, had left with a hired man and gotten married. And she still had relations with her natural sister who lived over in Steventown, New York. Now, her control of the purse strings at Hancock is notoriously tight. And she kept the sisters in the dwelling, I don't want to say in poverty, but definitely less comfortable than they should have been, given what we now know about how much money the Shakers cumulatively had from the sale of all the Western communities and some of the New England and New York ones by this time. She was not a friend of the Andrews, but she was the one who truly had the authority to sell things to the Andrews. But that hardly ever happened because there was almost no relation between she and Elders Fanny in terms of business. So it was Frances Hall, and we'll talk about this later, who made the decision to tear down the Hancock Meeting House purely as a financial necessity. We all know that the Shakers are very pragmatic about historic preservation, that they really are detached from the material as much as possible, so it wasn't a big deal to tear that building down. But how a lot of it was saved is a later interesting part of the story. Lillian Barlow and William Perkins were some of the people that the Andrews first met at the second family at Mount Lebanon. When word got over to Mount Lebanon of these young people so interested in Shakerism from the Hancock Shakers, they said, well, you know, why haven't you sent them over here? So the Andrews first met Barlow and Perkins right around the time that they wrote their first article for the magazine Antiques in August of 1928. And they received a wonderful letter back from the couple complimenting them on their work. And I'll read you a little bit of it. Dear friend, I want to tell you now why I like your essay on Shaker arts and crafts. It is distinctly different from anything I have ever read on the subject. It shows the patient delving into a subject you have considered worthwhile, and an honest expression of what you really know with characteristic gentleness. It is kind. It is free from subtle flattery so many people find necessary to boost semi-truthful statements. Usually we find in other writings about the Shakers cheap opinions by superficial observers in which truth has little part, mostly intended to bring the writer financial gain or mere publicity, the true subject matter being almost entirely neglected. But you have come to know us intimately. You are familiar with our daily life. You have seen the sunshine as well as the shadow, as well as the struggles of our difficult life. You have caught some of the blessedness we feel in our brother and sister associations, the joy of unselfish companionship, and the share and share alike of everything that is good. As a literary achievement, it is fine, but not a whit better than what we hope for and have a right to expect from your combination. So there's already recognition there in 1929 that this is a unit here that's at work. And that plays out in many different ways over the years in different realms, business, publishing, mounting exhibitions. But the two of them together seem to have been almost symbiotic, and it really would have required both parts to achieve what they did. I think Ted Andrews would have been, had a much more difficult time with the business of what they did had it not been for his wife. And of course, his scholarship undergirded all of their achievements. So now that they had had an entree into Mount Lebanon, the next family that they visited was the Church family, which at that time was basically the domain of the Neal sisters, Emma and Sadie Neal. who had been brought to Mount Lebanon in the very late 1850s from Williamstown, Massachusetts. These, of course, are blood sisters who have lived as Shaker sisters. They were also at Watervliet for a time. And the Neal sisters pretty famously did not get along. The story was, and this is in a lot of the oral histories, Emma's business and Sadie's agricultural. That's what Sadie used to say, Emma's business and I'm agricultural. They had already begun selling things to the world. This goes back before the Andrews. We've all seen the postcards of the South Family's chair shop, which also has other antiques. We've seen the postcards of Hancock's Fancy Goods shop. So the business of selling antiques was not new to the Shakers in any way, but I think the entry of the Andrews into that mix took it to a whole different level, because this wasn't now a tourist stopping by for a token thing to take home. These were people that, if they could, they would take everything that the Shakers could offer. So the journals of Sadie Neal, beginning in 1929, start to document the visits by the Andrews to the Church family. And this is a point where Mario and I took issue with Steve Stein, who takes one of these entries, one of, I think I found maybe 30 entries relating to the Andrews from Sadie Neal, where she says, Andrews couple come in the afternoon, select 2 or 3 old pieces and use considerable of my time. It sounds very dismissive and curt. Well, if you read her journals, everybody that comes uses considerable of her time. And, you know, this is just the way that she spoke, and I don't think it was in a mean-spirited way. This was just a rural Yankee kind of way. Her time is precious, and they're using it up. But it can easily be twisted to imply that she didn't like the Andrews. Well, the subsequent correspondence between them for their entire life until Sadie's death proves that that's absolutely not the case. It was with Sadie Neal that the Andrews developed one of their strongest relationships with the Shaker sister. Alice Smith passed away in 1935. She was another great friend of the Andrews, and but the friendship with Sadie did continue until her death in 1948, I believe. There's an interesting quote from Faith, recalling the underlying meaning of Sadie's reference to Emma's commercial. This is Faith Andrews talking. All she, Emma, cared about was people who had money, making her friends the money people, where Sadie was content to get money for the family through her gardens. Money meant everything to Emma. When she would offer to sell us something, it was only because she would double the price and think we wouldn't be able to buy. But it was always a piece we could not resist, and so we did. We bought from both of them, but mostly from Sadie. Well, that's pragmatic, but the friendship was also a key ingredient in the success of their business dealings. One other thing that the Andrews did of huge importance was to introduce Charles Adams of the New York State Museum to the Church family Shakers at Lebanon. Now Adams and a very young William Lassiter had already begun collecting from Watervliet, and when Jenny Wells went from Watervliet to the North family at Lebanon, they started to gain a little toehold there. But it wasn't until the Andrews introduced them to the Neal sisters that they began to really voraciously collect, particularly industrial artifacts, which were too big for the Andrews to deal with as private collectors with only a house to store these things. And it's because of that relationship that so much of that material survives in New York State. Now, interestingly, the Andrews are always present in Charles Adams' journals when he's visiting Mount Lebanon, because you do get the sense that they're really kind of shepherding these transactions. They're taking Adams to see the things that they don't really want, but they still want to have saved. So I'm not going to pretend there was no self-interest involved, because we know that that's not the case. Sabbath Day Lake and Alfred. One of the more controversial parts of the Andrews story, the earliest letter I found between the main Shakers and the Andrews. By the way, I should point out I had the very helpful and generous cooperation of Brother Arnold had in researching the relations between the Andrews and the Shakers, which was a little bit of a détente. If all of you know, the main Shakers don't really hold the Andrews in high regard. And I can say that I don't believe this book will be carried in their museum shop, which is kind of an interesting reflection of some of these bitter things that are still going on. But Prudence Stickney, she liked the Andrews. And I'm sure that the Andrews had written the first letter to her, but there are many letters from the late 20s and early 30s where she's writing them and just itemized lists of things for sale. I'll read you an example. August 31st, 1929. My dear friend, I am sorry to keep you waiting so long for an answer to your questions about the old-fashioned things made by the Shakers, but have been so lame it was hard for me to get around. Table in basement at office, $6. Table in sewing room, $5. Table in canning room, $10. Bureau at office, $25. Yellow sink, $10. Workbench in meeting house, $15. 3 children's school beds, $5 each for $15. I have one, and she goes on just listing all this stuff. This to me, combined with the fact that we know that the Shakers were selling antiques, and they still do at Sabbath Day Lake, and they still did it Canterbury through the 20th century, and they did it Hancock till it closed. And you have Shaker elders here sending out lists of what's available, just like a dealer would. You know, to imply that the Andrews were somehow wheedling this stuff out of these people and nagging them until they gave it up is just not true. Yeah, there are some instances of that in particular cases, but in general, no. They wanted to sell old stuff that they didn't care about, the Shakers, and the Andrews treasured these things. And the Shakers would often give first refusal to the Andrews because they understood, here's some people that really appreciate and care about our culture, and as Mario has pointed out many times, are making an effort to really the best that they could to save this culture, which of course is impossible, but they came as close as you probably can to doing it. So they are introduced to the main Shakers, and at that time they also extend their reach into New Hampshire, corresponding with Elders Josephine Wilson. And her letter back to the Andrews after a visit they made up there is pretty amusing. And it's written in both black typewriter ink and red typewriter ink, which I didn't know they even had red typewriter ink in 1930. But in the book you'll see it's transcribed with those colors intact. So I'll read you this letter. April 28, 1930. Dear friends, we are glad to have you come around to our opinion that the trip here and home again on the same day is too much, and we shall be happy to have you stay with us overnight. You have not stayed long enough at one time to call it a visit, nor to get acquainted. We have your things you left behind you in safe storage, and perhaps we shall be fortunate to be able to show you some things that have come to light during house cleaning time. Sometimes they do. I think your suggestion is a good one, to come the latter part of May, and then we may have more leisure to be with you. We hope so, at least. You say, quoting Andrews, it is kind of us to bother with you. That word is in red. Now, look the word bother up in Webster's dictionary and see if the definition applies to friends. That word is also in red. Pother means to make a stir. Better use this next time, or I will grant you do this, but you are not guilty of being a bother. So, in case you didn't, there's a word pother, P-O-T-H-E-R, which I think is, but she's saying, yeah, you make a stir, but you're our friends. And I wonder if it was on this trip that the Andrews found in one of the barns at Canterbury the what's called the ministry sideboard, which is now in the Cosby collection, one of the most famous pieces that they ever acquired. So here's Charles Adams, again, of the New York State Museum. What started off as a really fortuitous collaboration between Adams and the Andrews, gradually, like so many of the relationships the Andrews had through their lives, kind of unraveled and became a rivalry over the course of the 30s and the early 40s. Adams had already been working with William Winter in photographing Watervliet, and there was an exhibition planned of Winter's photographs in 1929. Winter wasn't ready for this yet, and it was at that time that Adams happened to meet the Andrews. He got Winter and the Andrews together, and they hit it off right away. And the first fruits of that was the 1932 exhibition at the New York State Museum with the accompanying work, the community industries of the Shakers, that Steve Miller, in his wonderful work, still acknowledges, I believe, as the preeminent study of the industries.
Sure.
Yeah.
At Lebanon.
At Lebanon. Yeah, right, of the industries at Lebanon, yeah. The rest of them have barely been touched yet. But I mean, that's quite a statement considering it's 2008. So Winter's photographs illustrated that book and also were shown in the exhibition. Well, the Andrews continued to work with him, of course, through the early 30s as they were preparing the book Shaker Furniture, which, as Mario pointed out, Julianne Force underwrote. One little-known fact is that during this time, right after Community Industries, Ted Andrews wrote Visions of the Heavenly Spirit, his monograph on the gift drawings. That work was never published. Of course, it was published in 1969, but at the time they couldn't find a publisher for it, and the Whitney Museum was not ready to publish a monograph strictly on the Shakers. So Andrews, basically without even missing a beat, moved right on and wrote the manuscript for Shaker Furniture, which is published in 1937. The conflict between Dr. Adams and the Andrews slowly built up, as I said, over the 30s. And by the early 40s, it was very clear that Adams had become a partisan of Emma Neal. The Andrews were still friends with Sadie Neal. And there's some pretty interesting letters and insinuations at that time about that relationship. Let me read you one entry in Adams' notebook. If you ever get a chance to use these at New York State Museum, they're remarkable. They're field notes, basically, from his visits to the Shakers. And they're written at the time, and there's lots of underlining and exclamation points, and you can see that even a dignified man like Adams is kind of shocked at what he's seeing at the Shakers. And I'll give you an example. This is from February 6, 1940. Just to give you background, Chamberlain is an employee of the New York State Museum, and Lassiter, of course, is William Lassiter. Baldwin's another employee of the New York State Museum, and Cornell is the hired man of Emma Neal. Chamberlain, with his auto, took Lassiter, Baldwin, and myself to Mount Lebanon to make plans to deliver by truck the purchases from the North and church families. Baldwin made another trial to get a good photo of Elder Sarah Collins. I spoke to Elders Lillian Barlow about 2 sets of the knockdown parts of all the kinds of chairs she makes and a photo of the lathes she wishes to clean up before any photos of the lathe. Then went to see Cornell about the Emma sale. Then Lassiter and I walked to see the Neals. They were friendly. I told Emma about the Western Reserve Historical Society collection. She again spoke of the Sister Allen, who should not have disposed of the manuscripts, but was always after money, a Jewess. Emma brought out a pair of yellow deerskin gloves with silk needlework, which she priced highly. Well, that's just what the Andrews said. Emma priced things highly. Called at Heiniger's office to get Shaker's number of pegboard and copies of school books. That's Lambert Heiniger, headmaster of what became the Darrow School. Then went to the North family and took a new photo of Rosetta. She changed to Shaker dress. He also took a photo of Sister Martha Wetherill, more of the corn drying room. Jenny Wells called me aside and said Rosetta did not wish to sell to me the medicine bottles I had once selected from the building back of their house. Told her I cared more for Shaker friendship than the bottles, etc. She added a note about the Andrews that was not favorable and suggested Rosetta was favorable to the Andrews. I don't see the meaning of this. I mean, he's dealing with all these sisters. They want to clean up before they get their picture taken. Oh, we'll sell you this. No, now we don't want to sell you this. Oh, she favors the Andrews, you know. So he's kind of caught in the middle of all this. And there's another entry where Emma Neal tricks Adams into making a pretty frank admission of his opinion of the Andrews. I'll read you that. In Sadie's presence, Emma said she would give me some textiles. This showed her favorable attitude. I had suggested to Emma that she will the pictures, gift drawings, to the State Museum. She thinks that these should not have been allowed out of official possession. Letterhead came from the Western Reserve Historical Society about some gift drawings that they had. Catherine Allen, a Jewess, had let them go. She said some had made a business out of the Shakers matter. I said, we did not. She asked me about the Andrews. I said they had made it a business. I asked what she thought, and she said she would not tell. I said, you asked me, told her not to repeat what I said, and trusted her. So, you know, here Emma's tricking him into saying, oh, yeah, the Andrews, they made it a business. But Emma won't say what she thinks, so she was pretty shrewd.
Christian, explain the Emma and Jewish.
Oh, yeah, well, this was, Steve Patterwick was very helpful with this. Catherine Allen's mother had been a descendant of the Mordecai family of North Carolina, a famous early American Jewish family. And so ethnically, or I don't know what you would say, but I guess it is ethnically, she was of Jewish heritage. What of course is so interesting is that in Shaker society that they would be using that derisively and going to a stereotype that she wanted to sell things for money. Anybody knows Catherine Allen. Catherine Allen is like super Andrews. She and Alonzo Hollister in terms of the preservation of Shaker manuscripts, because what they sold to John Patterson McLean and Wallace Cathcart constitutes the bulk of the Library of Congress and Western Reserve collections, which are two of the bedrock primary source collections for Shaker scholars. So, you know, it's, when I found those letters, you know, I thought, do I want to put this in the book? But then I thought, well, it's got to be warts and all, you know. And if it makes the Shakers look bad, I'm not doing it. You know, it's what she said apparently. So what can you do? So going back to the situation in Maine, this is a photo from July 4th of 1961, when is that Gertrude Sewell? Yes, Gertrude Sewell and Mildred Barker traveled down to attend an event, I think at Shaker Museum and Library. They stopped at Hancock along the way, and here they're meeting Ted Andrews out behind the brick dwelling. It was on this day that they made him aware of the availability of the Shaker Meeting House at Shirley, which resulted in its preservation at Hancock Shaker Village. But I just put this in here because it shows Sister Mildred Barker. Now, one of the more controversial things surrounding the Andrews was their involvement at Alfred during the time when Alfred was being closed. They'd already established a business relationship with Eldridge Prudence Stickney, and when the decision was made to close Alfred and consolidate the two communities at Sabbath Day Lake, the Andrews were quickly aware of the situation and obviously wanted to go and get whatever they could from Alfred as it was being closed. The diaries of Delmer Wilson and Jenny Coolbroth record the Andrews' visits during those times. They're very innocuous entries. There's nothing in them that can be construed as a negative opinion of the Andrews. However, oral history at Sabbath Day Lake, which has come down through Brother Arnold, who of course knew Sister Mildred and knew some of the other sisters, Elsie McCool, who come from Alfred, tells a different story about the Alfred Shakers' opinion of the Andrews. We have to remember that these are people being dispossessed of their lifelong home. So of course they're going to be very sensitive to other people coming in at that time and kind of picking things off the perimeter. But that's what was going on, and it was at the invitation of Eldridge Prudence Stickney for the financial benefit of the community. So there's good and bad. But I'll read you what Brother Arnold kindly wrote down for me, and which I promised him, whatever he said, I would put in the book without any change. Because Mario and I both agreed, as much as we want to redeem the Andrews in many people's eyes, we feel that the evidence itself does that. We didn't need to spin it one way or another. So I'll read for you what Brother Arnold said. There are only a few stories about the Andrewses that have been told here. Sister Elsie McCool repeated the first story. When the announcement was made that the Alfred community would close and consolidate with Sabbath Day Lake, it became apparent that we had a shortage of workrooms for all the new sisters. As the ministry shop was no longer being used, Eldridge Prudence decided to clean it out for them. Sister Elsie was one of those assigned to help with the task. Eldridge Prudence gave the young sisters items in the rooms, as she said the Andrewses would hound her to give these pieces to them. Rather than to see them dispersed without a reason, Eldridge Prudence decided to keep the objects in the family. Sister Mildred Barker and Sister Ruth Nutter told the other story. They were both Alfred Shakers, and they stated that the Andrewses would go through any building they wanted to without permission, looking at items they wanted to buy. When the truck from Sabbath Day Lake would arrive to take a load of goods back, the Andrewses would watch what was being loaded. If there was anything that they wanted then, they would follow the truck home, and before a piece was offloaded, they would ask to purchase it. Of course, the community was devastated at losing their home, and they were all busy trying to sort and salvage and keep things going until the move. Most of the time, someone would be crying, and the Andrewses would barge on through without any thought of what the people were going through. The only thing they cared about was getting the first crack at the antiques. When the Andrewses came to pick up their antiques, they stayed overnight at the office. They were given a tour of the village by Earl Campbell the following morning, and it was he who gave them the Elder Joshua Bustle drawings as they were being stored in the upper part of the ox barn, along with the other items from Alfred. He neither had permission nor authority to do so, but he did it anyway. Well, if there was still living authority at Hancock or Mount Lebanon, they might say similar things. The Shakers in these days clearly placed very little value on most of these antique objects. Matter of fact, they were generally only too happy to get rid of them and use the money to purchase modern furniture. Anyone who's looked at photos of Shaker retiring rooms in the early 20th century can see there's maybe a Shaker piece here and there, but in general, it's worldly made furniture. So I kind of am skeptical of the most of the time someone standing around crying and the Andrews would barge through. I think that's probably a little over-exaggerated, but we've heard their piece. So the perception of the Andrews at Sabbath Day Lake, particularly once Brother Ted came into the community, it just got more and more negative. And we'll hear a little more about that at the end of the story. Now, Alice Smith, as you know, was one of their best friends. She passed away in 1935, but fortunately, sometime in the early 30s, she made the momentous decision to reveal to the Andrews the gift drawings that she had. Now, one thing people often forget is that these were not the first Shaker gift drawings ever known to anybody, because, as we heard, Catherine Allen had sold a number of Polly Jane Reed drawings to the Western Reserve Historical Society. And I'm sure that McLean already had the ones that have ended up with the Library of Congress. So, however, what Alice Smith had are the iconic drawings by Hannah Cahoon. And we have three different kind of garbled accounts of how those came into her possession. In one story, she's a little girl, she's at the bake oven, and these, of course, the full text is given in my essay. She sees them about to go into the oven, and she says, "Oh, look, that's so beautiful, can I have it?" And whoever the kitchen sister was, let her have the drawings, and she has them through her adult life. In another, it's unclear how she gets them, but she says that she has shown them to a number of people, and they generally laugh or whatever. And when she showed them to the Andrews, if the Andrews had not reacted positively and with kind of reverence, that she was going to burn them herself. The last version of the story we have from Olive Hayden Austin, who told Dan Patterson that at least the first cache of gift drawings was discovered when they were doing spring cleaning and cleaned some built-ins in the attic of our brick dwelling at Hancock, and cleaned a cupboard that no one had touched for years, found the gift drawings in there. I think that's the most plausible of the stories. It's not to say that there may not have been one gift drawing that Alice Smith received as a child, but Olive's story definitely has more of a ring of truth, especially given what we know about the Andrews' discoveries at the brick dwelling at Hancock. That's where they found their copy of the 1816 testimonies in one of the attic built-ins. They found Father James Whitaker and Josiah Talcott in a chest at Hancock. In the meeting house, before its demolition in 1938, they found an entire chest containing copies of Lonial Phrases, which account for the bulk of survivals at that point. They also found another cache of gift drawings at that time as well. Yes?
And in 1988, in combing around as I was working on my exhibit up in the attic at Hancock, I found some great broadsides still in drawers.
Are you serious?
They hadn't been opened in 100 years up in the attic.
Which broadsides were those?
I won't talk about it.
Do you still have them? Because we want them back.
You got them.
Christian, who's in the picture? Who's in the photo?
This is Sister Alice Smith. And you can see behind her her wind-up Victrola, which I'm sure the Andrews enjoyed with her. And let's see, yeah. So she gave these drawings to the Andrews. Now Mario told a very kind of abbreviated version of the history of the gift drawings. What happened to the gift drawings in the mid-30s was that when the Federal Art Project came to Pittsfield to work with the Andrews to document Shaker culture, being the federal government and kind of the bureaucratic, neurosis of the federal government, because they were in the state of Massachusetts, the Andrews could not take these artists and photographers over the state line into New York to document Mount Lebanon. The Andrews wrote to Holger Cahill, who was the head of the Federal Art Project, and kind of tried to point out to him how ridiculous this was, because here they were the experts on Shaker culture, and you had these two great sites, but they couldn't take them to Mount Lebanon. So when he still refused to let them do that, the Andrews just flouted his decision and took them over there anyway. When the Andrews later tried to bill the government for their expenses in taking the artists to Mount Lebanon, the government refused to pay. And so at that point, Andrews was terminated without prejudice from his position as a liaison for the Federal Art Project. Well, during that time, the Andrews really had the scoop on the gift drawings. And they put them down in the vaults of the Whitney, as far as we've been able to deduce, for safekeeping. My gut is that they didn't want to be scooped by one of these artists who would have, drawn or photographed some of the gift drawings while Andrews was working on his monograph. And so it was because they were in deep storage at the Whitney for a number of years, and Juliana Force paid this money towards the publication of Shaker Furniture. She felt that that was the least the Andrews owed her for her generosity, was the gift drawings. And the way that they found this out was she had auctioned off her Shaker Furniture off in 1938, and she asked the Andrews to come in and kind of do a pre-auction appraisal or something like that, so she would know reserve prices for her things. When they came to look at all the lots, they found, to their surprise, that all the gift drawings were there. So they took them back to Pittsfield without a word. And then, as you can read in Mario's essay, there's this series of polite and then increasingly angry letters accusing the Andrews of, belching or whatever, taking back something they had never given. So, an interesting side.
2 points. One is that it was Christian who got those letters for me at the Whitney. That greatly enriched my essay. But the other point that might have gotten overlooked is the incredible lack of understanding in the federal government that a culture could cross a state border. And the Andrews, worked to try to persuade them, look, the Shakers in New York State are the same organization as the Shakers in Hancock. But no, the WPA in New York is different from the WPA in Massachusetts and so on. So it was incredibly obtuse on the part of the federal government. And the Andrews, as usual, tried to fight the wall and lost.
Mario's generous to give me credit for finding those. What he's not telling you is that in return for that, he gave me a case of Brooklyn Lager. Brooklyn Pilsner. Yeah, which was great. So, Sister Alice Smith, what's that? Yeah, if you got anyone needs research done. Sister Alice passed away from stomach cancer in 1935 in the brick dwelling, and she actually died in Clara Sproul's arms. And, her funeral was attended by not only Shakers, but other people in the outside community, and Ted Andrews was one of her pallbearers. So, there's a deep personal connection there. Not a cynical, exploitative one, I don't believe. So we get to the destruction of the Hancock Meeting House. Ted Andrews, when he learned that the 1786 meeting house, the second Shaker meeting house ever constructed at Hancock, was going to be demolished, he wrote a letter to Berkshire Eagle. And this is one of the earliest calls for preservation, maybe in the country, but certainly in Berkshire County. And in his editorial, he pointed out that Pittsfield had already lost the Treaty House, I think that's what it's called, where the end of the Revolutionary War had been celebrated, and had lost a number of its other 18th century buildings, Charles Bullfinch Church, and now we were going to lose this Shaker Meeting House. Anyone who knows Pittsfield knows they've been their own worst enemy in terms of preservation, basically to this day. First floor of this building for $150. Well, consider in 1937, the entire publication cost of the Shaker Furniture book from Yale was $1,100. So $150 for people, he was teaching school, but they're not awash in money, is a considerable sum. So what did they do? As the building is being dismantled, they documented it photographically, again, unusual in those days, and they also hired an architect, a man named Sieber, to come and do an interior elevation drawing of the meeting room, a watercolor, as well as some drawings of the doorways of the front of the building, these two doorways. And they decided that they would go talk to Sadie Neal about the predicament. So they told her that the meeting house was going to be torn down. And I'm just going to read you the account as Faith Andrews recorded it. Okay. Sadie Neal said, this is in Faith's oral history, Sadie said, "Do you know what it would cost you to get the meeting room? That is where the dances were." And we said, "No, but we'll find out and we'll come back and tell you." So we found out. We went over and saw the people who were going to take the building down, and they gave us a price for saving the meeting room. 8 or 10 more windows, all in perfect condition, and painted that pale heavenly blue. 2 stoves to heat that room, just a magnificent place, and built-in pieces. By the way, I'm unaware of any of these built-ins from the meeting house, but I would love to know what they look like, if any of you know about their existence. So we went back that afternoon and told Sadie, and Sadie said, "Yeah, you wait a few minutes." And she went into her bedroom and took the covers off her bed and reached under the mattress and pulled out a little satchel and sat on the bed and counted out the money and gave it to us. And that was the most amazing thing. She said, "Yay, if you want it, it's yours." So, you know, I point out in my essay how ironic it is that a Shaker from another community is having to give this couple money to pay off the one that doesn't care at Hancock to save this architecture. Of course, we still have this meeting room architecture as well as the doors that you see here, and some of the ironwork survives as well. And none of that would be without the Andrews and their deep relationship with Sadie Neal. This is another view of the meeting room before it was demolished. And the doors in this picture are currently on display in the exhibit at Hancock.
Why did that?
Well, the Shakers have always been extremely practical about disused buildings, and they really hadn't used the meeting house for worship regularly since the 1890s. As a matter of fact, by this time, their worship usually consisted of sitting in the meeting room of the dwelling, singing a few songs from the 1908 Canterbury hymnal, and then listening to radio evangelists like Billy Sunday, or maybe they would drive into Pittsfield and go to the Episcopal Church. They liked the Episcopal Church. They liked the Christian Science Church in Pittsfield. So it was very, you know, again, disintegrating. And so when a building was a tax burden, because they always paid their taxes, even if they didn't have to legally, but they did, and a fire hazard, they would tear it down. And a lot of times they would reuse portions of demolished buildings for other things, but by this time, there was not anything else really being built. Although there's some speculation that some of the framing of this building was used to build the dairy L at Hancock off the 1910 barn where our discovery room is. We haven't been able to definitively prove that yet, but that L was built later that same year, and the structure of it is 18th century hand hewn beams with, you know, what we'd expect to see if it had been the meeting house. So we get kind of approaching the end of our story, and one thing that Steve Stein made hay with was Ricardo Belden's letter criticizing the Andrews' seminal work people called Shakers. He also mentions Marguerite Frost's criticism of that book as well. But Belden's is really the most strident and also the most humorous. So here's why I give the Andrews a lot of credit. When Faith was transmitting their archives to Winterthur, she could have thrown this letter in the trash. No one knew about it this time. They had a copy of it that Oxford had sent on to them after they received it from Ricardo Belden. She kept it in the archives, but she did write a little cover letter to go with it. She says, "This letter to the editor of Oxford Press expressing his dislike of our history is typical of Brother Ricardo, a member originally of Enfield, Connecticut Society. He was left on the steps of the village Shaker Church when he was a very young baby. His clothes indicated that he came from a well-to-do family. At that time, a boy named Charlie Ross was missing, probably kidnapped, and the Shaker story has not been verified. Newspapers of the day would doubtless carry a full story. However, Ricardo's reputation as a Shaker leaves much to be desired." And those of us that have heard through various grapevines about Brother Ricardo indicate that, yeah, that's probably true. He certainly was out of community for a long time. He was known, you know, well, I shouldn't say anymore, but nothing really bad. I mean, he was a good man, but he certainly wasn't a Giles Avery or a Harvey Eads or something like that.
Did he live in Florida?
Yeah, he was AWOL in Florida for many years, and then each winter he would go to Florida while the rest of the sisters froze up at Hancock. So here's Brother Ricardo's letter dated October 1953 to the Oxford University Press. Dear sirs, I have read the book People Called Shakers. I do not like some parts of it, as they are the sayings of people of the outside world and are no part of the Shaker works or teachings, such as are printed on page 46 and other pages in the book. On page 139, the picture of the square order shuffle is in disorder and not in proper form. On page 232, the picture of Frederick Evans is no likeness of him. I have met F. Evans several times in my life and remember him well. On page 154, the picture is not a good representation of believers' worship. On the front of the jacket, the picture does not represent any form of our worship in my time. It is disorderly and misleading. And it's a picture from David Lamson's book, so he might have had a point there. On the back of the jacket, the picture of the singing meeting is disorderly. Brethren should not sit with knees crossed in meeting when sisters are present. Yours sincerely, Ricardo Belden. Then he goes on. I was placed with the Shakers at Enfield, Connecticut when I was 4 years old, and I united in the marches and dances from childhood up to the time they stopped using them in their worship. I still know how to perform them. I see on the back of the jacket a statement that E.D. Andrews is the highest authority on the Shakers. He is not an authority high or low on the Shakers. There is no authority on the Shakers other than the Shakers themselves. Now, it's a fair point as a religious person to feel that way. Certainly, you can understand his point. Of course, by this time, the Andrews certainly knew tons more about Shaker history and Shaker life than Brother Ricardo did. But he, of course, remains an authority because he is a Shaker. And then there was an article in the November 1953 Albany paper called the Pictorial Review, which was titled New Book Records History of Area Shakers, which had some more ranting from Brother Ricardo under, I think, a kind of cheeky subheading called Shakers Arouse. Over at Hancock, Mass., a white-bearded patriarch, Brother Ricardo Belden, who will be 85 on December 22nd and is senior of only 2 remaining male Shakers, is outspoken in his righteous wrath. He consented to be quoted on this much. I consider it a very unfair writing about the Shakers. Some of it will be misleading to the outside world, and some absolutely false statements are made about the Shaker order. Andrews, or any other person in the outside world, cannot be an authority on the Shakers, except the Shakers themselves. And so anyway, well, there were many positive letters to the Andrews from Shakers about this book, as there had been for the community industries and Shaker furniture and their various articles. And the music book, The Gift to Be Simple, which is often overlooked, but as Shaker music aficionados know, is the first scholarly treatment of Shaker music as well. The Andrews really covered everything. But it is important to give the negative side as well. Now, coming to the close here, much later in life, Faith Andrews renewed her friendship with Olive Austin. They met when Hancock was opened as a museum. They didn't meet, they first had known each other back in the 20s and 30s. By this time, she had moved down to Clinton, Connecticut and married a man named Morris Austin. And Olive and Faith had a correspondence which began again in 1961 and continued to 1974. And it's a pretty remarkable correspondence because during these years, both of them lose their husbands. And it's something they kind of console each other over. And particularly interesting from Olive's point of view, having grown up a Shaker to deal with the loss of her husband. There was a letter in August 6, 1974 that she wrote to Faith. Of course, that's the 200th anniversary of the Shakers' arrival in America, where Olive states, "Today is the 200th anniversary of Mother Ann's landing in America. How this country has changed since her day. Some things for the better, others, sad to say, is not so good. I suppose they're having a big celebration at S.D. Lake, but just as happy I'm not there. Wonder what Mother Ann would say if she should return. She wouldn't be able to recognize the truths she taught, I'm sure." It's an interesting statement. And we don't know how aware Olive was of the schism between the Canterbury ministry and the Sabbath-day Lake Shakers, But we do know that really one of the main causes for that, Brother Ted Johnson, was no fan or friend of the Andrews. And unfortunately, other than Brother Arnold's words, Ted Johnson's words really remain the last interaction between the Andrews and the Shakers. When the Syracuse University Press was considering the publication of a new edition of the Community Industries of the Shakers under the title Work and Worship, they solicited Ted Johnson's opinion as to the work, and his response completely quashed the project. And those of you that have read the Shaker Quarterly can read some pretty vicious reviews that he wrote of some articles that Faith Andrews had written, which are basically her edits of unfinished works of her husband. So they shouldn't have been judged quite so harshly as he obviously took pleasure in doing. So that, I think, is what has colored the opinion of the Sabbath Day Late Shakers of the Andrews to this day. And I mean, I'm certainly not out to try and change their mind about anything, but it would be nice if there could be some kind of stepping back from that, but there probably never will be. I want to close with one more thought, one more little piece that was so unfairly used by Steve Stein, which was a letter from Sadie Neal, written to the Andrews, right at the end of, well, near the end of her life in 1942. Her sister was to die the very next year, but they were pretty much estranged, and her visits with the Andrews had become more and more unfrequent. Now, in his book, Stein just kind of casually tosses off that the Andrews were referred to by some Shakers as antique pilgrims. His source for that is this letter, this very short letter, dated October 13th, 1942. Where, oh where, are our antique pilgrims? And where is the Scarborough School and the dean and instructor thereof? I would like some more reliable information than the newspaper gives. But what I want to know most at the present time is where are our antique pilgrims? With much love, yours ignorantly, Sadie A. Neal. This is, a lonely old lady wanting her friends to come pay her a visit. Antique pilgrims, they might be, but, that was a part of their relationship, but there was much more to it, and it was not a term of condescension as Stein frames it in his work. So that is kind of the sum of what I found out about the Andrews and the Shakers. I'll be surprised if any more primary source material surfaces, because the Andrews letters, as far as I've been able to find out, do not exist, because the Western Reserve collection was acquired too early for their letters to the Shakers to be present. And a lot of the later archives, at least at Old Chatham, where I did do some research, I wasn't made aware of anything that they have. I wouldn't be surprised if there's something that they're going to wait and spring on me later. But so it's unlikely, I think, that anything else significant will turn up. And the sum total, as I found it, was, yes, a complex relationship with a lot of good things, a lot of bad things, both within the Shaker families and the Andrews relations in the Shaker families. And I think we really would be foolish to expect anything more or less than that, because